welcome everybody to a VFS industry talk. My name's Joe. I'm going to be your host, but I will do my best to shut up as much as possible. I just wanted to do a big shout out to Max Harvey for helping set this up, and Fraser Cave, who's one of our VFS writing students who also helped put this together.
Yeah, Fraser was the one who contacted me over Twitter and made this happen.
Well, thank you so much, Fraser. What a great opportunity for us all. So yeah, obviously, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Cory Barlock, who is the creative director on God of War 5, 20-year sort of games industry veteran. A little bit about his background before we launch into it. You started out in VFX, as we were sort of talking about before we started recording. And then you moved into the absolutely important seminal title, Backyard Wrestling, Don't Try This at Home, which
So good.
I definitely tried it at home. I'm sorry.
You tried it at home, and you violated the terms of the use.
And then you went on to the God of War series initially as an animator, game director, and story writer for God of War 2, which you won a BAFTA for, which is quite an honor, and all the way on to God of War 5. And I just kind of wanted to open up by talking about the fantastic making of documentary Raising Kratos, which everyone should check out. There's a moment in that at the first announcement at E3, which was 2015, 2016?
2016, yeah.
2016. And, Kratos steps out of the shadows. The crowd goes nuts. And you can even see the smiles on the faces in the orchestra. Those like cellists and people who are normally stony faced are grinning. And you're there with the controller. So what did that feel like?
I was so freaked out and so stressed out during that entire thing that at first it didn't occur to me that people were cheering. I just thought it was like sounds of the air conditioner or something like that. And then when it kind of occurred to me, I was like, oh wow, that's awesome. It was very exciting. I think at that time though, what was going through my head is please don't crash, please don't crash, please don't crash, because we had rehearsed what to do if it crashed, and I really wanted to be able to make it through this entire demo because it was such a ridiculously ambitious idea to play with a live orchestra while we were playing a demo of a game that we were really, really, really far from finishing to actually reveal. So I'm very glad it went off without a hitch, but not certain I will ever do something that insane again because it was a lot of stress.
I mean, I can only imagine. It's so funny. We were talking before about how the games industry is kind of in this like almost 1950s Hollywood era, and like a live accompaniment is something you get with silent films, not with, what a crazy idea to do that for the announcement, but it worked. I mean, the reaction was just.
Yeah, it was an amazing moment in time. I hope that we get back to a new normal that is allowing something like that to happen again, to do these sort of fun spectacles, because they're not necessary, right, for the reveal or release of any game, but they're fun and they're community building, right? They make you feel connected to something more so, I think, than you ever really get. Like movies, I felt connected to movies when I read about them and when they came out, when I picked up the VHS copy of them. But like something like that, you feel like you're part of this community, connected close to the people who are actually making it, and that's awesome. I hope we don't ever lose that.
Yeah, I think it's something that makes the games industry kind of unique in that way, and yeah, it's a real asset, I think, as well. So I wanted to ask, you sort of came back to Santa Monica Studios after a little bit of time away directing cinematics for the Tomb Raider reboot. Pardon me. Let me call that. So what brought you back to Santa Monica Studios?
Oh, so I left in 2008 for a couple of reasons. One part was I was super burned out. I had been going full bore nonstop since 2003. So I went 5 straight years. We released God of War 1. I went immediately into writing and directing God of War 2. And then we released that in 2007. And then I immediately, before it was released, went into writing and laying out God of War 3. And I kind of hit a wall hard mentally and physically, and was saying, I need to take a break. But they're like, you can't take a break because we really have to keep going. Everybody's, we got a whole studio full of people. And I realized, like, you know what? I need to creatively diversify a little bit. I gotta find some inspiration on the outside, but I also got to try some different things. Otherwise, I might end up just making the same God of War game over and over and over again, and not really growing as a creator. So I kind of left there and ended up working with a ton of people. Most of that time was spent working with George Miller. Like we worked on that Mad Max Fury Road thing, and we were going to make a game and a movie and an anime. And I was working on the game piece, but kind of writing a story that would connect to all that stuff. So I got to see Fury Road in its storyboard form, in 2009, I think, well before it had come out. And he kind of walked me through the whole movie, and it was astounding how much they had figured out. But what I learned from that, like we didn't ship a game. Like the Mad Max game that came out was sort of loosely based on the work that George and I had done, but we kind of moved away from the project well before they were going to finish. Just wasn't going the direction that I think either of us wanted. But the sort of the lessons that I learned about character, about drama, about writing, about directing, were in a conference room, right? That we would hang out for years. Like for years, I would just be sitting at a conference room with him for hours talking about different story things, talking about pitches, doing outlines, character studies, all that kind of stuff, and getting this education that I really could not have gotten anywhere else. And it was that education that made me realize, okay, I need to probably step back into making a game because this is great working with him, but the reality is their focus is film, and I don't know if the game will like ever really get off the ground. It's not a dig against them. It's just that they first and foremost are filmmakers, and I don't think they need to spend their energies trying to diversify into games like that. So I was going to go direct the second Tomb Raider. So they were in the middle of making the first Tomb Raider, and I went there to kind of immerse in it a little bit and then start planning what the next one would be. And they lost their cinematics director, and they ended up saying, "Could you step in and finish the cinematics?" So he had shot a bunch of stuff, and it was all like and basically in pieces on the floor. So I kind of worked with everybody, and we pulled it together and finished the game. But I realized very quickly that they did a really great job on that first one. That Tomb Raider reboot was really fantastic. And what I wanted to do was really test the knowledge that I had learned. And that meant I needed to do something bold, bigger. And I think they wanted the next step, the next logical step in what was going on. I was like, yeah, I don't know if I'm able to just get behind that. And I had been talking to Santa Monica a little bit prior to that. And they said, hey, you want to just go and do something crazy with God of War? And I was like, okay, when you say that, though, I'm going to do something really crazy. I want to go way off the reservation. And they're like, yeah, that's fine. We need to reinvent this thing. So I was going back mostly for the challenge of saying, all right, I'm going to take them up and make them, stand behind what they just said, which was, I'm going to go crazy with this. And that first year, I put together a team of like 10 to 12 people, and we really kind of hammered all the way down to new Kratos, throw out everything. He's going to be a dad, and he's going to have to figure out how to be a human being through having this kid that he has to teach how to be a god.
It really quite sort of, it seems so obvious now having played the game, but like, what a revolutionary sort of idea to kind of take a character through that sort of growth, which that's really what I got out of it, out of the game. It's about growth.
Because they were really behind it. I expected a lot more resistance. There was resistance at first when they didn't know what I was doing. So I got a lot of people from different departments of Sony, like in the executive branch, that would come in to visit. And I was like, I'm not pitching the game yet. I'm not telling anybody what it's about. They're like, that's fine. We just want to talk about what we don't want it to be about. And I was like, all right, interesting. And I don't think they were coming in to say, don't do this. I think they were just trying to offer their perspective based on like, hey, our data from European players and our data from US players and where the franchise was after Ascension, because it had just released, and they kind of did a brand health study of it. And they wanted to share that with me so that I didn't end up making some of the same moves because players had expressed disdain for those moves. And I was like, oh, okay, this is really good. And quite literally, one person said, we just hope that it doesn't end up something where Kratos puts on a backpack and walks up to Scandinavia or something like that. And I was like, I totally was stone faced. I did poker face, didn't let him know that like, oh, well, that's exactly what we're doing. But I was like, okay, is there a leak in the office? Does he know something? Why does he say that specific? And he really just, had the worst view of what that could be.
Yeah.
So that when I pitched them later, I think 8 to 12 months later, I pitched those same people. He was laughing. The person who actually had said that, and he was like, "Ah, this is so much better than what I had just said." He's like, "But I'm glad that you guys kind of did what you were going to do." So it was nice to have the full support of Sony for these insane ideas, because really it's like take the character that's really unlikable and has a very rough and very mature and very anti-hero personality, and we're gonna make him softer and be a dad and kind of go on this sort of coming of age adventure with him and his son.
Yeah. I
Not the
mean,
logical step.
no, no, yeah, but like I say, it totally works. And that kind of leads into one of there's a few questions sort of popping up in the Q&A box here, which I welcome people to do that.
I'm not sick of the boy meme. No, no.
Sorry.
Someone said, "Are you sick of the boy meme? Or am I all about them?" I'm all about them. All about them. That's great.
Oh,
It's
which
basically a highlight of my procrastination. Boy exists solely because I didn't want to decide on the kid's name because I had like 3 or 4 options that I liked and I just couldn't decide. So we had to shoot, we had to write scenes. So I was like, whatever, just call him Boy, until we figure out the name. And it went on for way longer than it should have. I did not get his name for a really long time. And it was a lesson for me, like that trust your gut. Even if it means everybody else is saying, come on, man, you got to hurry up and do this. No, like if it's not right, it's not right. Rushing something just to appease an artificial date that somebody gives you, like you need to figure out the kid's name by 2016. No, you don't, right? You need to figure out when it's right, when it feels that you've hit on the correct thing. And I think that's the essence of that entire game, is that we didn't get forced. It took years to cast Kratos, and I was getting pressure from everybody to just cast the person we had as the highest sort of probability, but they were still not feeling right. They were a great actor, they just didn't seem to mesh, and we couldn't find the right person. And I was getting tons of people saying, just cast this person, just move on. We have to hit this date. And I'm like, what date? Like you're making this date up, and it's not right. And when it feels right, it's right. And when Chris Judge auditioned the first time, it was right. I knew it in the moment. I knew it in the room after the first line. Actually, when I first saw him come in with that crazy Superman tank top, looking like a Greek statue, that I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I think this guy is probably right. And I've been watching him on Stargate because I'm a giant Stargate nerd. But I didn't want that to cloud my judgment and say like, oh, just because I love him on this. But he was perfect, right? And it's not. That's the essence of I think making anything. You have to trust your instincts, and when your instincts are saying something's hinky, something's not right, it's not right. Hold back. Resist the urge to fall prey to peer pressure.
which must be tough. In the documentary, you say something along the lines of sort of doubt being the devil in your ear, as it were. How do you sort of just sort of personally find a way to quiet those doubts and stay the course?
That is really hard. I don't know if I have any sort of true methodology, right? It's like compartmentalization, where I can sort of make myself forget about it by hyper focusing on another thing.
Hmm.
Is really the only survival technique that I think has been consistent. But that doesn't mean that I'm not, staying up at night until 4 in the morning, panicking, and constantly worrying and questioning decisions that I make. Even when I'm like, this is definitely what I need, and then I move on to the next decision, I'm still questioning that decision throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the month. Uh, it never goes away. That's the unfortunate reality, is that you're always going to have that, and it's more of you're making peace with the screaming demon in your ear that is like saying you suck and no one's going to like this, or the actual people on your team saying you suck and no one's going to like this. We had one guy that told me on the floor, the while we were trying to do the final tuning for the demo for 2016, it was about 2 weeks before we had to lock, uh, and everyone was in a panic. I mean, it felt good about the demo, but like it's still, we're gonna play this live, and I had been rehearsing every day, multiple times a day, trying to get that demo locked in, and he just did not like the ending of the demo. He didn't like the way I wanted to go in a different direction. Instead of ending on a big monster, that like had a big sort of Arnold Schwarzenegger action line, right, where it's like I've been looking for you, uh, like it just I was like, no, we need to end on a different note. We need to tell people this is a different kind of game. And he was not having it. He was like, look, you're ruining the franchise. You are embarrassing all of us. This is going to go off horribly. It's going to go off with a thud. And I was like, okay, I hear you. And just what I took it in. That's great. I'm sorry, but if you want me to talk about it later. But inside, I'm like, what if he's right? And you can that never goes away. I wish there was some magical elixir or amount of experience, but everybody that I've ever talked to, whether they worked in the industry for 2 years or 20 or 40 years, they all have that same level of doubt. Even when they're certain that their idea is going to work, it's hard not to let the doubt of others around you, and there's so much of it in to kind of break your armor and make you question yourself as well.
I mean, it's the results really do sort of speak for themselves, and I'm very, very glad that you were able to to quiet those doubts, because it's such a bold direction for the franchise. And I don't know if you're seeing any of the comments streaming in, but people are really just sort of thankful that you gave them this experience.
Oh,
I was wondering if I could sort of backtrack just a little bit, just in case there's anybody sort of listening in that's not too familiar with how sort of development companies work, and sort of ask you, what is a day in the life of a creative director on a AAA game like? Maybe in pre-production, in the middle, and 2 weeks before you ship.
okay. Let's see. So early on in any sort of game development, it's going to be meeting with people and writing and sometimes just sitting and staring off into space, and trying to imagine. Okay, so early on, it is a lot of talking and discussing and thinking and sort of writing things up. So you're doing a lot of pitching, and the pitching evolves from small conversations in the hallway or small conversations in a room to small write-ups like, hey, what about this, we talked about that, like to a more formalized, here's a paragraph of where we're at, to a more formalized PowerPoint presentation. And it kind of evolves, right? And literally every conversation you're having is building a brick in the wall of your sort of pitch. So there's never really, even dumb conversations that seem like they have nothing to do with anything are actually, related to your overall pitch. So everything is kind of going in the soup, if you will, throughout all of this, even when you're going the wrong direction. Because like in the first, year, we went in the wrong direction. We wrote the wrong story and focused on the wrong characters and did everything wrong. And we learned from that. That wrong taught us where the right was, and that was awesome. And that sort of daily routine is this sense of one, being inspired. So like in the early portions, sometimes I'm playing games. It's like the only time I ever get to play games is when I'm in the early portions of development, because that's the time I'm sort of researching and looking at other things. But other than that, time is so precious and limited. I don't really get to immerse myself in other people's games. But then as you get further in, you've moved past the pitch. You've convinced, for some reason, the executives to give you a large sum of money and resources and time to make this thing. Then you're starting to work on the boring stuff and the fun stuff simultaneously. Staffing plans, interviewing tons of different people, starting to work out like best practices, and then talking to design and tech and art about the high level and how we start to drill down into the details of what this is. For me, as a lot of it is getting that outline and then doing a pitch to the team. And that pitch is done many times and evolves throughout. So on the last one, the pitch was 3 hours. So I did a 3 hour talk through the entire game, starting at the beginning and going to the end. And the first pitch was not even at all what the game was going to end up being. It was like structurally sort of there. It was the heart of what we were trying to do. And it was the goal that they were achieving. But a lot of the beats were just like stand-ins because I had to get a pitch done quickly and get everybody behind all of this. And then as development goes through and I work with the writers and the rest of the team, we find all the right beats throughout. So creative directors are basically just talking all the time. Like we are in meetings all the time, jumping from one subject to another, and then spending a lot of time trying to beg and convince people to do things. That's another big thing. Is really like, hey, please, I need you to do this, even though you don't think it's a good idea. The no cut camera was a a few people that were like, cool, this is neat, I want to try this. But most people are like, I don't get this. This is a lot of work and effort and expense for very little payoff. And I was like, yeah, if you show a small clip, it doesn't seem like it's going to be that much. But trust me, the overall large thing, I know I'm very excited right now. Dude, lay down. So the overall is going to mean something more, right? You're gonna feel it when you don't feel like you've ever cut away in the game. But it's hard. If nobody's done that and nobody can really see it, most people just look at the work and say, "This is you're committing like 8 months of my time. This is a big deal." And I have to kind of again sort of talk them off the ledge and then let them know that we're going to go through this together, and I'm being as sensible as I can so that there's ways that we can find easier avenues to do this. We will do that. With code, the programmers, it was the Atreus. We'd never done a companion before. We'd done interactive things inside of the engine and had characters that sort of navigated a little bit, but we never had a full-on AI character that could seemingly, act on its own. And that was a big deal. And they wanted me to go over and talk to the programmers at Naughty Dog in an effort to get me to not do this. They're like, you'll talk to them, you'll know how hard it is, and you'll see how hard they worked, and then you'll be scared. It'll like, scare me off of the concept. And then it turned out that, they were like, yeah, we threw everything out like 6 months before release and, redesigned it. And then Ellie was basically done in a few months. And I was like, oh, this is great. So I walked away with the worst message, which was like, guys, they did it in 2 months. This is great. Like, we're going to have no problems whatsoever doing this. And they were like, this is the last time they send me to another developer because clearly it backfired. But yeah, during that period, you are talking and conversing and pleading and begging and pitching, right? Pitching is a persistent thing throughout. It is first initially like the local people around you, and then it goes to the executives to pitch and beg for money. And then you consistently start to pitch the team and continue to beg them to do the things that you're asking and find clever ways to solve these problems. Then you get into the next phase where you're pitching the PR and the marketing people of how we're going to sell the game out there and what it's supposed to be. And then kind of coming back around to the team as we finalize things. You are playing the game all the time, watching play tests and giving feedback, and then just checking on all the progress of everything. So you're literally cycling through every aspect of looking at VFX for characters, looking at animations, feeling the combat moves on the sticks, trying out different combat scenarios, looking at levels and the final lighting inside of them, as well as then looking at the UI, checking the text, verifying lines, seeing how the characters sort of live inside the world, and is Atreus doing the right moves in the right places? Does he feel like a living character? It's everything. Like there isn't any one aspect doing the music, the final sound mixes. It's exhausting. Like it is an overwhelming amount of work, and it's great to have competent directors that you work with. So you have a directors group that, as the project goes on, everyone starts to find their rhythm together, and then you can really start trusting. Okay, take this, all the way, so that I only need to see that final stretch, that they've taken it to a certain level, and I can go like, that's amazing, that's so great. And then also in the finals, you realize you're overscoped. So you're scoping the game the whole time. You're always cutting stuff. So right from the point of starting to pitch the team, the game's always too big. It'll never get done. I think our initial estimates were like we were, 6 years over budget on the art schedule. Like it was absurd. Like I'd never seen something that big. I was like, all right, I'll figure out we have to keep cutting it, and then you're just cutting the whole time. Like you're finding ways to, shrink and be more efficient and sort of drown your darlings, if you will, all the time. And then you get in that final phase, and you got to make some really scary giant cuts, right? Where I think in the last, 8 months we cut, or probably the last 12 months we cut an hour and a half of gameplay out of a section at the end. So we had to figure out how it connected with the part before it and the part after it. That's a very difficult thing to do when you're that far in development, everything's already finished. and this one part in the middle wasn't finished and was never going to get finished. And it,
Again, could you be sort of more specific about, like,
oh yeah,
the solution that you found, or?
yeah, we had a section where Atreus was become, we called it the sun jerk moment, where he realized he was a god,
Hmm.
and then he started kind of letting it go to his head. And we had planned for like 3 to 4 hours of gameplay where he would slowly evolve to this kind of jerky kid. And dad would have to kind of rein him in a little bit and realize, like, oh, wow, he's acting like a jerk. And his evolution was meant to mimic a little bit of Kratos in his evolution to, God of War 2 and God of War 3, where he kind of really evolved into an even bigger jerk than he already was when he was the general. And we just could not afford that section from an art perspective. We could do the animation, we could do the cinematic stuff. We just, from a level art and environments, we just could not afford it. It was no time. We were already outsourcing to like 3 different houses, and everyone was just overburdened at that point. So we said, all right, we have to cut this, but we have to fix the moment. It's still, he still has to become a jerk because we've done a bunch of stuff afterwards that presupposes that this happened. So we couldn't get around it, and everyone else was like, okay, but I've got so much work. We're never gonna get all this stuff done, so we can't add anything. We just have to cut and figure out a quick way to tape it together, which is impossible. There was no way to do that. And the animators of the cinematics kind of came to me, and they had an idea, and that was the whole Atreus raging out and passing out, and the fight with Modi in the temple. All of that stuff was supposed to happen in another location and was supposed to happen much later. And they kind of came up with an idea for a cinematic that they pitched me, and I was like, that sounds great. And the best part of it is, had I pitched this, everyone would have been like, we don't have the time, that's too much work. But they were the ones doing the work. They were the ones that came up with the pitch, and they were the ones that pitched to everybody else, and everybody got on board. Everybody ended up doing more work than the environment stuff that needed to get finished, which was crazy, but it turned out even better. So that thing that sucked of us having to cut, and it did mess with the pacing. He became a jerk a little too fast, and then he like stopped being a jerk really fast, and it felt abrupt. And people rightfully called us out on it because it was like we just nothing we could do. We couldn't add anything else there, so we had to accept what we had. But still, that moment where Atreus rages out and sort of mimics his dad and goes into rage mode, but then it overcomes him. That wasn't part of the original plan. We talked about it a long time ago and thought, would it be neat if he went into rage mode, but he's too little, and it would like cause him to overheat, if you will. But then we dropped the idea years prior, and they had remembered it and had a really cool way to set it all up. So we got something good out of something somewhat bad, right? And that last section of the game, after you've been spending all your time kind of tuning and playing the game, talking to everybody on the team as they're trying to final, right? And really, I trust a lot of my leads and directors to triage, our bugs and be smart and say like, hey, this is something we're not going to fix. This is something we can fix. So I don't get heavily involved in like trying to arbitrate between the bugs unless it's a really big deal that I'm like, I want this, so let's figure out how to solve this. And then you're starting to prepare for the sort of PR junket thing at the end. So you've already just run a marathon, and then you get to fly around the world and then be in different time zones every single day and talk about the game, which that part is fun. But I was already really, really tired. So it could have been way more fun had I had about 2 months of sleep prior to that. But then I slept a lot a few months later. So it kind of,
Finally.
yes, finally. But yes, talking, writing documents, writing emails, and begging are essentially the tenets of creative direction.
Excellent. So yeah, the life's a pitch, basically, just constant pitch.
Right? Life's a pitch, and then you die. I think that's
Um, a lot of questions kind of popping up in the chat here, covering, a lot. I'm sure there's a lot of excellent writers out there in the chat who are wondering just how to get their first break in the industry and wondering about those, these are your first steps sort of thing. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how you got in, but then how you see the industry today as a place where people want to work.
okay. So yeah, my path in was weird and non-traditional and sort of a roundabout way. I was in film school and ended up moving from the film department to the animation department because the film department required everybody to work together and crew each other's films and just reliance on other people, and people were very unreliable in that film department. So I had a roommate who made an entire film in his computer, an Amiga 3000, and I was like, how did you do that? And immediately transitioned over to the animation department, started using like the Wavefront way back on the SGI machines, and 3D, 3D Studio Max, no, Lightwave. Sorry, 3D Studio Max I used when I got in the industry, but Lightwave was the first sort of package I used on my own computer at home, and started studying all of that and learning. And I was I was fairly mouthy even back in college, and I was upset that I didn't feel like the teachers were teaching us enough, right? I was like, oh man, I learned this in a tutorial last night, and I feel like the teacher didn't even know how to do this. I was a jerk. But the the thing was, at that time I still was firmly believing, man, I feel like I can learn more. I should just get a job. And someone was like, yeah, why don't you go ahead and do that? I'll bet you can't get a job. And I was like, oh yeah. And we literally bet like $50 that I couldn't, get a job in the industry. So I quit school, started working at Funko Land selling used video games, and then spent 6 months making a demo reel, an animation demo reel, and then like making 300 VHS copies, 300 copies of a cover letter. And I looked at the back of like Cinefex magazine and, on the back of games, for the addresses of game companies, and whatever address I could get for a video game company or a visual effects house, I would basically send that out. So I sent out 300 of these things, and only two of them called back. 3D Realms and Disney, which was a company called DreamQuest Images, and they did live action visual effects for like Armageddon and Kundun. And when I went there, it actually was Inspector Gadget and Mighty Joe Young. So I went and worked on Mighty Joe Young. Ironically, I was offered a job on Duke Nukem Forever as my first job. So in 1997 or 98, I was offered a job. I'm like, this is going to be a big game. Everybody who just shipped the recent Duke got like a Ferrari. You're going to love it here. And then they shipped Duke Nukem in like 2012. So that would have sucked to stay there for that whole thing. But yeah, I went and worked on visual effects, and that was really where I wanted to go anyway. I won the $50, but it was super sketchy. Like that was a dumb decision because I was 3 years into my education. I could have just finished that last year, but I didn't, and that was not so smart. But it worked out in the end. That's why and it's very unusual. So I don't think everybody's going to be able to do that path. But when I got there, I realized that I loved movies, and I did not love making visual effects for movies because visual effects are the last phase, and you have no input whatsoever on the movie at all. You are literally just putting the glitter on it, and that's it. And it's fun if you love the animation for the sake of animation. But I also was really wanting to be part of something great, and I constantly was pushing for that and felt like I was just the loudmouth idiot. And I was politely asked to leave, or I was politely suggested that maybe games are better for you. And I was like, oh, really? And because I had worked for Disney, right, it seemed like I was really important, for my first job. So the second job was a little easier to get, where I had a couple people, saying yes. But really, there was a Cyclone Studios was a video game company in San Francisco. So ended up working on first-person shooter there. Then I worked on Crusaders of Might and Magic for the PS1. And then I went down to Los Angeles again and started working on a bunch of fighting games, Rocket Black and Robots and X-Men 1 and 2 and what are some other terrible Backyard Wrestling. Yeah. Woo! 1 and 2. I worked on 2 Backyard Wrestling games. Oh yeah, that was good. And again, the whole time I'm like, I want to work on something great. I don't feel like I'm able to change anything. I was part of it. I was able to make suggestions on the game, but at the end of the day, I worked at a company that needed to keep the doors open. And it was no disrespect to them and nothing wrong with them. They needed to keep the doors open. So they were the typical third-party publisher or developer. The publisher tells them to do something and they got to do it because the publisher's holding the check at the end of each month, right? And you've got to make payroll. So you do whatever it takes. So we make games in 6 months, right? 6 months and 9 months. And it was just like churn and burn. But the people I ended up working with on the first God of War game, all, a lot of the core people worked there. So I had made these connections and, trained and learned my craft, if you will, throughout that sort of trial by fire of rough games. And a lot of them ended up coming over when I went to work on God of War 1, and that was called Dark Odyssey at the time. And I actually went over there just to get a job to make money. And I was just gonna make money and try to make my own movie. So I was like, yeah, I'll make money, and then at night I'll start writing the film, and then I'll save up, and then I'll quit the job and make a film, and it'll just be like Tarantino and Reservoir Dogs. I'll get famous and make tons of movies, and that never happened because that's not a good strategy, right? You kind of just gotta follow your gut on, okay, I feel like this is what I need to do, and you make whatever like compromise you can to make that happen, for sure. But at the same time, don't be blind to any great opportunities that are right in front of you. And that was the illustration of Dark Odyssey. Whereas I went there like, whatever, I don't care, right? Like they said, oh, we have another person who's going to be the lead animator. But you were a lead over at the other one, so we'll look at you both. It's like we'll have a Thunderdome. You guys can, for the first few months, whoever's the best, we'll choose. And I was like, don't choose me. I don't want any responsibility. I'm like, just give me some things to do, and then I'll do them. But yeah, I'm not interested in being a lead. And I shouldn't have said that because after the first 2 weeks, I realized like, oh my God, this is it. This is the good thing that I've been complaining about for years that I didn't get to work on. And now here it is, but it's still in a bunch of pieces and it's still not really there. But I can see that potentially this could be that good thing. If this isn't a cash in, it was a studio saying, we're going to make this game great, even if it takes years. And for a PlayStation 2 game to take 3 years was kind of a big deal, right? And the budget that they spent was big for the time. So I was like, okay, I have to do this. And, sort of the rest being history of like throughout that, being able to just be aware of the moments that I'm in and know when an opportunity is presenting itself. That's the I think the biggest sort of luck of my career has had so many different things happen, and I've been present in the moment to realize like, okay, no, I should do this. This is important. I should focus on this. I should put the extra effort into something like this. From a writer's perspective, a pure writer's perspective, trying to get into the game industry, every single thing uh, that is going to get you the job, I guess the one thing that's going to get you the job is a great writing sample. That's what's going to get you the job. The sort of closing the deal is meeting people and realizing that you're not a crazy person, right? I think that's the second part is that great writing sample, just starting out, and then yes, in person, not a crazy person. You can be a crazy person. Suckily, this sucks. Once you're famous, then you can be as crazy as you want to be, apparently, and everyone makes concessions for it. But when you're just starting out, you need to be like the person everybody wants to hang out with, because there's 1,000 other people that can do this, right? But the great writing sample is a succinct piece that is not over like probably 10 pages, and it explores characters. It shows an arc for them to see where they're going to grow. Doesn't need to be a complete arc like in a film, but you really see some growth of the character. You see the connections between the characters, and you make the person reading it feel something, right? That's the most important thing. I can't tell you how many writing samples I've read that are so enamored or in love with the technical aspect of the formatting and the I have an RPG script and it has the 5 different responses. That's great, but that can be taught to anybody. I don't care, most people don't care if you know that. They might say it as an excuse not to hire you if they have some other reason, but it's nonsense. Anybody can be taught that in like an afternoon. None of that matters. What matters is you have clear writing that grabs people. You have a point of view that even if it's not the same point of view of the studio, right? You don't have to write something to say like I could write something that's exactly in line with your studio. Eventually they may get to the point where they're like, all right, your style is so different from ours. Can you show us something in our style? That's fine. But I think your sample can be universal. It can be the same sample used for everybody else. If it is a small, concise piece that deals with, at least 2 characters, and you really feel something. You've seen that the work has gone to a bit of an emotional sort of depth, right? And it's not just an action piece. Because again, action, good to write, but not as important, especially when you're starting out. You want to write something that makes people go like, "Wow, this is really cool," right? And you don't want to give them something long. You don't want to give them a TV pilot of 30 pages. You don't want to give them a movie script or a novel, uh, and you don't want to give them like one comic book page, right? You want to give them something that feels like there is a beginning, middle, and an end, at least for the character's journey within that scene, within the context of the scene itself, versus the global context of where the character is going to go. Um, but beyond that, like seriously, don't worry too hard about any of the formatting and anything like that. Because if you have something that makes people go like, "Wow, I remember, read this. This is cool," right? That makes people feel something. That's gonna get you in the door, and then you're gonna get into conversations with everybody, and then just don't be a jerk, and acknowledge that you're starting out, right? That's the I think for me the biggest thing that I had to deal with in the beginning is that I got the job at Disney. I thought, yeah, I'm awesome, right? I let that go to my head very fast, and that was stupid. And I wasn't initially capable of absorbing all the lessons that I needed to learn early on. So it was a struggle that I had to deal with, and it took a few years for me to get to that point where I realized, like, oh, okay, yeah, like I gotta. I hate this term, but it is true when it comes to this kind of industry, whether it's the film industry or the games industry, the comic book industry. You got to pay your dues, and your dues are learning, right? You're in there and you're learning how things are done. You're learning how people work together. You're learning how this specific studio makes games or makes movies, right? And how the political system works in the studio because everyone's different, right? It's sometimes structured and hardcore, and sometimes it's just like this weird socio-political thing. Uh, that even when it's friendly and it's fun to be around there, there's still like a hierarchy of like, I had somebody, come to me their second week on the job of the last game and like go full on to pitch me a whole new way to do something of one of our boss battles. And there was the second week there, and they kind of circumvented like everybody. They circumvented their lead, the directors, the people on the cinematics team. Like they just circumvented everybody, and they were enthusiastic and they were so excited. And I know why they kind of just wanted to hang out and just tell me about this to show that their stuff, and that's awesome. But it's sort of I think rubbed some people the wrong way to feel like, oh, you didn't want to come talk to me and tell me about this. So it started off on that wrong foot. So how you relate to people, how you treat other people, and how you acknowledge, especially if you're just starting out in the industry, that you are just starting out in this industry, right? And that it's going to take years, sadly, to kind of get to a point where people are like, hey, man, I want your opinion. Please bring that person in there. Let's talk about this. Um, like being able to say, I'd love to be part of this meeting. I have some ideas if you ever want to hear them. Those kinds of things are great because it shows that you're enthusiastic. But if somebody says, no, we don't have time for that, cool, move on, do your thing, right? Because it's not somebody trying to diminish you in any way, shape, or form. It's that there are 300 other people on the team, and there's a certain way some things are done. And at that time, maybe that's not the best time to do it. But every single person who is working in this and many other creative industries that is in a position of say and able to channel or move a project started out in the same place. They all started out like trying to get their voice heard and trying to see what their opportunity is. And I think a lot of the people, a lot, not all, because there are some people who are just jerks from the beginning and somehow they failed up. And it happens, and that sucks. But there are a lot of great people that I work with that got to the position they were in because they worked really well with other people. They helped elevate those around them, right? They supported everybody while they were working, and they did whatever it took, right, to to kind of be part of that group, and that is the one of the most invaluable things you can learn, because everybody's way in is so different. I met somebody at a GDC, and we were at a bar of one of the hotels that they have at the GDC in San Francisco, and we just started talking, and he had these funny observations on games, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then I started asking him more questions. I was like, God, this guy's super smart, and I thought he was like, senior level person in one of these other game companies, and I was like, oh, this is cool. Like, it's nice to meet somebody else in this the sort of same field that has these interesting perspectives on games. And it turned out he was a medical student in Florida, and he had just got back from Haiti doing a sort of internship, and he hated medicine and he wanted to not pursue it. So he wanted to get into games. So he just got on the damn plane and went out to GDC, and we started talking. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. Like you're very insightful for somebody who has no experience whatsoever. I was like, we didn't keep in touch. You know, I'd like to see if I can get you in maybe as a junior level designer or something like that. And then when I went home to the studio, I pitched it to everybody, and they were like, "No, we have no interest in that's no, we don't need anybody else that has no experience." And I was like, "Yeah, I know, but he's really smart. Like it was interesting. Like he understands how to really analyze and break down games." Like, yeah, no, we're just not interested. I was like, "All right, fine." So I did what I normally do, which was not listen to them and then pursue forward anyway. And I had him do the level design test, and I took his name off it, and then I took 3 of the other level design tests we had gotten in the last month, and I said, look, I'm having a struggle placing the leveling of these people, right? Is that people come in and they say they're this level, but you never know, and I know what I would place them at, but I kind of want your guys' opinion, you know, kind of look at these tests, and then each one of you just tell me like this person is at this level, and this level. And they had no idea what I was doing, which was super crafty, and they kind of all came back and put him at a senior to a lead level. And I was like, okay, brought them all back together. I said, I know this was devious, but I wanted to prove a point. Uh, the person you placed at the highest seniority is the person that has no experience, that it wants to get out of medical school and come here to do this. And they were like, holy crap, this was really good. Like, this was really one of the smarter level design tests. This was good. If this is his first thing, they're like, yes, bring him in, right? And he was a level designer on God of War 2, and then he ended up quickly elevating to the head of external product development in the studio. Worked there for years, and now he's a creative director over at Annapurna Games, right? And all of that because he knew how to communicate. He knew how to talk about things, and not one portion of his communication style was talking about how something sucked. Not one part of our conversations was ever, these guys suck for this reason, these guys suck for this reason, because every person who talks about things that suck, and that's all that they can talk about, very rarely has anything to back it up, right? It's the people who come in and say, you know what they could have done with this? This would have been cool. Or like, oh, I played this and this was awesome, but man, I wish they would have done this, this, and this. That is the absolute sort of golden ticket of creatives of every field, whether it's an engineer, whether it's an artist, whether it's a writer, whether it's a designer or a creative director, because anybody can complain about things that they hate, right? And I was one of those people early on. I bitched and complained all the time, right? And I thought that made me special and discerning, and it doesn't. It just makes you bitter and it makes you angry sounding. And it doesn't mean you can't dislike something. Absolutely, I'm not saying that. Everybody should be able to dislike things. But if your entire sort of creative approach is always talking about what other people did wrong or how other people suck, and you never really have that backup to this is what I would have changed, right? Because you know when people do that to me, I'm always like, what would you have done differently? And if they're deer in the headlights and they got nothing, they move on, right? They've had their shot and they may get another shot later, but they lost it. But if somebody's like this sucked and they come back and like damn, I'd have done this, I was like, okay. And then we can talk about like the best way to do this is start with the things you would have changed, start with the things that are good, because the environment conducive to great sort of creations is one of I think positivity. And it sounds corny and cheesy to say that, but the reality is creating these is hard. It takes a long time and a lot of effort and work, and you just don't want to be surrounded by everybody hating everything all the time as much as you want to be surrounded by people going, you know what we could have done with this? You know what would be great? You know what would be awesome if we did this? We should try this. That energizes me. Even saying it, I get excited, right? You get a little goosebumps saying it, right? This sucks. You sort of biologically change a little bit, and it's not in a good way, right? Hating on something doesn't take you down the path, I think, to creating something great. It simply just takes you down that path of wishing you would have been the one to come up with that. Like this stuff. And not every time, because obviously there are things that just plain suck. I should know. I've worked on a lot of them. But the reality is, like, we just don't get anywhere creatively if all we're doing is being negative about it. So I think those things can apply to literally whatever thing you want to do. Whether you want to work in audio and make sound effects, or make visual effects, or any of these things, is to be able to sit in a room with a bunch of people and ask them questions and genuinely care about the answers. But then when they ask you a question, really dig in and talk about how you would have solved something. Because a lot of times, if you've got no experience, you're going to get speculation questions. How would you do this? What would you do? Like if you're an engineer, I'm sorry, they're going to ask you the worst questions ever. I mean, they're great interviewers, but they ask questions they don't even know the answer to, but they don't indicate they don't know the answer, so they put you in the hot seat. I'm sitting on a bunch of engineering interviews that I'm just like, oh man, we're a lot easier in the design and art side. But yeah, be able to just take even a question that questions your previous answers. If they're like, yeah, you were wrong on this, what would you do here? Is you don't get flustered. You don't, oh yeah, you don't fire back at them. You're like, oh, that's a good point. What would I do? Well, let me think about that. Let's go on to the next one. And then if you have the answer right away, tell them, talk them through it, get up on a whiteboard. Even when not asked, like the people that we're always most impressed with are the people who get up from their seat when they're asked a question and just start going up to the whiteboard and be like, hey, can I do this? That even if they don't ask, I don't care. If they get up and they go to the whiteboard to do something, it means that they're comfortable expressing themselves and saying, I need to draw this. I think that's great, right? Like, as nerve-wracking as it is to interview at companies, uh, it shouldn't be, right? You shouldn't look at it as like, oh my gosh, this is an audition or something like that. It's really not, right? You went to school for this. You spend time playing games. You love what you're doing. Like this is just going into a room and talking about what you love. And when it comes off like that, when it feels like that, is usually when like the best interviews happen.
I think
That's a long answer.
wonderfully insightful. And there you have it, folks. If you want to get into games, you just need to get a medical degree first.
Yeah.
So that actually takes us to 1 o'clock. I mean, there's tons of more questions I could ask, and the Q&A is still pretty full. Cory, do you still have a bit of time? Would you like to carry on?
Yeah, I totally do. Let's start responding to some questions. Throw them out there, and I'll answer.
So a question I saw a little ways back that just made me laugh, and I'm sorry I can't remember who asked it, but who do you think would win in a chicken leg eating contest between the Hound from Game of Thrones and Kratos?
Oh wow, I don't know, man. I mean, we have Kratos is a much more thoughtful eater. The Hound is definitely like the Coney Island hot dog eating contest. So I think the Hound would beat him. Yeah, yeah. Kratos likes the chicken wings for sure. But I think the Hound would win.
And then, so as you came up through the PS2 era, which was just kind of the Wild West, it seemed, for games at the time. And there's a big head mode was a big thing, right? And alternate cheats and stuff. If you were going to put cheats in the God of War 5, what sort of effects would you like to see?
Oh, like the big head mode, or yeah. Wow. What would I put in there? I would love to bring back all the silly costumes from the early God of War games, the COD of War and the corporate Kratos and all that stuff. I thought those were fun. But it's that those things are way more committing now. Like making a funny costume is, a commitment of months. Whereas the PS2 era, somebody made a funny costume over a couple of days, right? And that doesn't diminish their abilities. They were just really good and they could do it fast. Doing something now, individual art assets is such a commitment and so difficult. And then you have, more legal approvals and more people sticking their nose and their opinions in it, saying, "Oh, I don't think you should do that." I really wanted to do a pink armor in the last game because of that whole EA thing where they were saying, we don't do character customization in Star Wars because nobody would want to. We don't want them to make a pink Darth Vader. And I was like, why not? That's awesome, right?
Yeah.
Like as the Star Wars owners, I'd be like, we didn't make it canon, but if you choose to make a pink Darth Vader, that's awesome, man. Like let people play. It's like people spray painting their Darth Vader figure that they bought from the store, but then saying you're no longer allowed to change your figures after you buy them. That's stupid, right? Like it is an interactive industry, and we should allow that. Absolutely.
It's a real sort of conversation, really, like it seems, between developer and audience. And now that games get patched and DLC and stuff, that's only kind of becoming more so of a conversation. How do you have any thoughts about how you see the industry kind of developing over, as we're on the eve of a new generation?
I think it's going to get more interactive and communicative with the audiences. I mean, I'm seeing the trends of like, uh, I don't want to say I'm old school because I think that's a cheesy thing to say, but like, I like the idea of releasing a game, and what you release is the game, right? We have some patches to things that we just couldn't possibly fix, right? Or the photo mode and things like that. Being able to add things and support it as it's done is great, but kind of releasing a game that clearly could have used another 6 months in the oven. That's I hope that doesn't become more commonplace. It kind of feels like we're trending towards that simply because everybody's live now, and we kind of take it as this. You can be a beta when you sell people stuff, and I don't know. I don't like that because as a player, I really don't like you know swarming through a ton of bugs and dealing with all of that. But I think there might be a point, in 5 to 10 years where it contracts. The communication between the two sides contracts, because unfortunately, there is this groundswell of not so great communications between the sides that makes it very hard. This goes back to me on the creative side of, it's I don't really care if people don't like something, but the idea of like seeking out a developer, especially if it's like a developer who was a level designer or an animator on the project, and just like to go at them specifically and personally and say this game sucks and this is why you're a terrible human and all this stuff. I just don't get that. That's always the thing that for me indicates we may end up contracting back. Like, I don't care if people come at me and say horrible things. It's not nice, but at the same time, I'm fine with them doing that to me. I don't like it when other people on the team are getting attacked for something that was out of their control, right? And you see this a lot on many other teams where, people who had nothing to do with any of the decisions there. A lot of times it's publisher decisions, are just getting the full brunt of people just hating on them. And I don't know, it's just weird to I guess behave that way with something you love so much. And when something lets you down, when you love something so much, and then it's like, man, this game let me down. Like I really was looking forward to this, and it's terrible, and let me down. Yeah, it's disappointing, and that sucks. But at the same time, you still love games. You still love this industry, and it's fueled by the human beings who work like mad behind the scenes to make these things. So the last thing you want to do is like personally go at them and tell them how much they suck. Uh,
I
so I
would,
think that's
yeah.
a scary trend we're going into. I hope that doesn't make the industry contract with its communication.
But I'm sort of personally very hopeful for kind of the opposite, really. You do sort of see that, the dark side of the force on Twitter here and there, but equally, like, really positive, wonderful comments. Like, the chat here is just constantly blowing up with people just so enthusiastic and passionate about these things. And I would, I'd like to see it go the other way. Consoles now have like dedicated share buttons, don't they? Like, they want people to share their experiences, which I think
That's
is
exciting. It's really exciting. Like that ability to turn people into, the content creators. Like you are taking content and you are then creating off of that content is super cool. Like from the photo modes and the streaming all the way to like dreams, which allows you to create full freaking games, and share them with people. That's amazing. Like I think that is empowering and opening us up to a possible future of so many neat and innovative and crazy directions that none of us would have ever thought of, simply because the people who are going to take that weird direction, they didn't have the access to any of these tools. And I think that I agree with you. I want to see that future, that positive future. And I think eventually we will all totally get there. I just hope we can figure out how to moderate some of the other aspects, that make it hard for people who create to actually communicate and interact with the audience.
yeah. So here's a question that I dreamt up last night at about 2 a.m. So I apologize if it's not entirely coherent.
Oh,
Um,
good.
I was sort of fascinated by how long it takes to make a game and all that goes into it. And when you embarked on this odyssey with God of War 5, you were a new father yourself, and now your son, you say, is 7 years old. How did that impact the story of the game? And like, I'm thinking specifically Atreus, like, was your son going through the terrible twos and you thought, Atreus is going to be a real jerk now? Because
Yeah.
did it bleed in at all?
Yeah, all the time. Like the writers both had kids, and they had their own experiences. They were farther along the journey than I was, so they were kind of in the early portions telling me about these things. And yeah, the terrible twos became the terrible every age. Terrible threes, terrible fours, terrible fives, terrible six. Like it was rough. And I'm also then working a lot, and it influenced it tremendously. Things changed because of interactions that I had with my son, interactions that Matt Sofos and Rich Gobert, the two writers on the project, that were on from the beginning, their interactions, right? And they would change on the set sometimes. So somebody going like, "Yeah, my kid said this to me last night." I'm like, "Really? Let's add that. Let's put that in. Let's try that. Let's just see what that feels like." And I think that freedom to take that bit of real life and quickly add it in, right? Like because Matt and Rich and I were on set together, we wrote the script together, and we were there throughout the entire development of the game. We had the agility to constantly evolve, right? And it was painful in the beginning because we struggled with finding that relationship dynamic between Kratos and Atreus, whether it was too nice or too mean. It was a real struggle to get to that place. But individual moments are all borrowed from my life, Matt and Rich's life, people on the team's life. When they come and tell me like my kid did this funny thing, or when I was younger, I said this to my dad. Like we just had a wealth of you know uh, things to pull from to try to make it feel as real and genuine as possible. I think none of us felt like we were the expert. I think that's the good thing is at times when we needed to fight for something, obviously we would be like, we know what we're talking about. Just leave us alone. But most of the time, we were very happy to have somebody say, this would be better, you do this. And it's like, oh my gosh, you're right, that's so much better. And yes, it's still my gut making the call of saying like, yeah, actually that is better. 9 times out of 10, if it was a better idea, I would always go with that. And then the 1 time out of 10 would be actually we kind of have to stick with this because it connects to these 10 things. I'm like, if you have anything that still stays within this realm, I'm open, right? But it's the ability to take it in and then process it quickly and say like, yes, we should include this, and have everybody get on board with that. Because I know, I think maybe on God of War 2, I probably would not have felt as comfortable on the set, suddenly changing a bunch of stuff, right? Where, like Linda Hunt is there or TC is there, and I'd be like, yeah, let's try this new thing that none of you had on your sides. I'd probably be too, like, oh, everyone's gonna get upset. And there was always like, production people there. And I just didn't have the confidence, I think, as a director. But now, I guess I just don't care, right? Like I'm just gonna, if it feels right, I'm gonna do it. And if somebody gets upset, I'll try to deal with that afterwards. But it never enters my mind in the beginning. When a new idea or good thing comes up, I don't think about like, would somebody get upset or mad about this? Like I've been able to shed that insecurity. Um, but then the insecurity just manifests as everyone's gonna hate this after you've done it. So after you commit to it and you spent like a bunch of money on the set, and then it comes back in the studio and the data, then you're kind of like, oh man, did I screw up? This is terrible, right? That's the insecurity that never goes away.
I mean, I keep saying this, and I can't kind of sing the game's praises enough. A lot of the choices that you made that I'm sure were difficult choices to justify, like the uncut camera, and not only do you want an AI companion, you want a kid AI companion. Like, is there anything that raises alarm bells faster? But if I can be very self-indulgent and just, I remember about 4 hours into the game, and I'm super invested, and all of a sudden this thing pops up at the top and it takes me, I'm like, what the heck is this thing? And I was like, oh, that's my radar. And I was like, I'd forgotten I was playing a game. I had gotten so
Yeah,
into it that, and then I was so invested. And I think that kind of, more than a graphical leap, that sort of feeling to me is what kind of pushing games forward is all about. And as we go on to PS5, I know obviously you can't talk about any specifics about Ragnarok, but are there ways that you're hoping to keep pushing that immersion?
Yeah. I mean, that's cool. That's that part in the boat. Like when you get in the boat and all of a sudden we give you your sort of mini map and or your compass, right? And you're just like, that was a big controversy in the studio, by the way. That I think many people were on board and thought it was a great idea to wait until that point, but there was the camp of people that were like, you're introducing this brand new thing really far in the game and it might be disorienting. Um, but fortunately, everybody found a middle ground and got the right moments to trigger that, and it kind of all flowed in. But I think in the future, like what I'm looking at, what I think a lot of the people in the studio and our contemporaries at other studios all over the industry, I think we're all kind of looking for that way to get what you talked about in the beginning, is to get that feeling of being inside a game, of holding a controller, of looking at a television screen to fade away, to lose time, to be so immersed in it. And honestly, people have lost time in games that have menus and you're clicking through all this stuff because you're just so engaged, right? You are grabbed with this core concept, with the way that it's like doled out to you slowly and kind of fed the complexity bit by bit, so that it's just this perfect synthesis of all the concepts coming together and making you go like, whoa, it's like been 8 hours. I can't believe this. Some people are doing it in the form of, the cinematic presentation and the connection and the fusion between gameplay and cinematics. Some people are doing it with the innovative new ideas that attach to your brain and say like, oh, this is weird to think about. Like, I want to solve this problem and figure this out, and it just feels really cool to actually have figured it out. I mean, yeah, for us, it is about that further elimination of the gamisms, right? The things that we've as an industry relied on. Like I use that same concept of saying like, look, we rely on the film industry's, verbs and communication style to change camera angles and do cuts during our cinematics because they've been around forever and we love movies and that's what inspired us, and we reference movies when we're talking about setting up cinematic sequences. So why not just use that? But I was like, yeah, but we're games and we don't have to do that. We literally can have the same camera for 12 hours, 20 hours, 50 hours, and we could do fun things with that. And like what else can you do? Like, do you need to have cinematics in a game? Is that necessary? Can you figure out a way because in life, there are no cinematics, right? We don't have cinematics, but we get the concepts of what's going on around us. We see the drama of what's happening to people in our immediate vicinity and how that connects to people further out of that immediate vicinity. We have our interactions with people that create tension and sort of evolve and have an arc. And we do all of this. We see amazing vistas. We go to the Grand Canyon and we see this amazing thing, but we don't have a crane behind us pulling out the camera and showing us this wide vista shot so we can appreciate it. We simply experience it. And it's like games can offer us that possibility. And we don't need any of those artificial things. We can do things inside the game, come up with new tricks, new verbs of our own, and start to own our industry and the way that we interact with the audience, that is vastly different than film. And it's not to, belittle or denigrate film, because that's the world that they live in, right? But I think our world is this sense of, you can take Blade Runner and you can take, a game. I wish I had a great example. You can take God of War. We'll just say, because that way there's no negative implications of this. And you can bury them in the desert for 150 years. And somebody who pulls out Blade Runner will watch it and have the exact same experience that a person had back in this time period, right? They will interpret certain things. They will connect to certain moments in different ways potentially and have a view of it influenced by their modern understanding of the world. But when they pull out the game, the possibilities of having a completely different experience from somebody who experienced the game here, the things that can happen inside of there are uniquely to games, right? It can change and evolve over this time, and us embracing that and figuring out more ways to, and I don't want to say procedural because a lot of times that's this like silly ass buzzword that people use in marketing presentations, but there is an aspect of the fact that you can make the game feel very different every single time, even if you are telling a linear narrative story. Indigo Prophecy, which I think was called Fahrenheit in Europe, is that David Cage game from a while back. And the first hour of that game in the diner is absolutely and utterly brilliant in its ability to present a whole sandbox of possibilities of things that happen. It doesn't pay off in the rest of the game to have that level of complexity, and you could tell that it was just really hard to get that you couldn't really scale it to the rest of the game. But man, playing that and seeing all the different possibilities that you can do there, and again, looking at it now, it doesn't seem like a lot of possibilities because the industry's moved further on. But at the time, that was really innovative. That was absolutely like groundbreaking for me to say, this is astounding. Like, we should be looking into things like this. And everyone's like, that's insane. It would take forever. Your game would take, years to make, 5 years, 6 years. And I was like, 5 years? And then we made a game in 5 years, and that sucks. And games will probably end up being longer development cycles too. But the way they're kind of probably balancing it out is make it a live service game, and then it could take 10 years to make the game, but you get to release it at 3 years, and then just keep updating it throughout, which in some cases that's fine. I mean, I don't like that, but other people do, and that's great. Right? That's their type of game. It's not really mine. I like to get the game and then just play it and experience the whole thing, be able to think about it, come back, try it again, try different things, but never feel like I'm sort of forced at this community level to participate in something on Tuesday, because after Tuesday it will never be available again, right? Like, that's too much pressure. That's homework, man. Like, I don't have that kind of free time to be able to dedicate to that. Animal Crossing stresses me out.
Oh, yeah. You don't play the game for 2 days and all your little islanders are giving you grief. It's not cool. Um, this is I was talking to my parents before doing this chat, and I think I was explaining. It kind of blew my dad's mind. He probably hasn't played a game since Pac-Man. So, like, and I think it was the first time he's ever got where video games are at now was describing God of War to him. Do you feel, as the industry has grown, do you feel that you wrote God of War 2 and God of War 5 for different audiences? And do you ever feel like maybe Sony had a different audience in mind than you did?
I definitely think, for me, I think the God of War series has been written for the same people who just grew up with us.
Cool.
That, like, the latest God of War that we worked on was truly us, like, all becoming parents and responsible adults, and some of us, buying houses and getting mortgages and being a role model for a tiny human, as shocking as it would be. That growth, was reflected in, I think, how we were to each other, how our studio changed, and then how we were as developers, like what we did differently. Because God of War 1 was thumbing our nose at the establishment. It was, a very famous Japanese developer saying Western developers can't make good action games. That is a distinctly Japanese thing. And at the time, they were right? Onimusha, DMC, these were all like great action games that were coming out of Japan, and we just weren't doing anything that was uh, holding a candle to these sort of sacred franchises. But then, Eric Williams and Eric was the combat guy from my years, our years at Paradox, working on those not so great games, and ended up being the guy who built Kratos from a combat perspective. We were like, you know what? Screw that. We're going to take on that challenge. We are going to make a Western game that people look at and say, that's a great action game. That can, at least, be called an action game in the same breath as these greats from Japan, right? So we didn't, I think, really believe we were going to be better than them. I mean, we wanted to be, but I think deep down we were still like, yeah, hold the phone. You're not that special. But we wanted to compete against them. And then the second one was that proof of, I'm not a one-hit wonder, and the sophomore slump won't take us, although it scared me to death that, the follow-ups are usually the things that make less money and nobody likes them. So that was scary. And I think we adjusted for the audience of saying, we're going to give you more, right? It's all about more. We're going to go bigger, do everything bigger and go crazier. And I think the same thing applied to 3 when I started writing that one. And that's when I burned out and realized, like, man, You know, I don't know if that's the the best path for me. I can't make another two God of Wars because I feel like I'm just going to run out of ideas because I have no other creative inputs around it. So,
Sure. Um, then one thing when playing the game that kind of I could hear the sleepless nights of all the design folks was the Bifrost room or sort of Tears Vault, and kind of what you ultimately do with that, which it's not like the Crash Bandicoot 3 warp room. It's core to the story, it's core to the gameplay. What was the approach for the design of that place, and kind of how did it develop over the course of making the game?
I think with the phrase, okay, I hear you, we can't do that, but what about this? And then that phrase was just said for years as our initial hope was I want to be able to open up a portal in any location in the game and say, I want to go to this location and then walk straight through to that location. And then it was like, that's insane. We don't have the memory. We don't have the loading scheme that would allow us to do that. That's not going to work. Okay, I hear you that that's impossible, but what about this? And at one point we were going to have doors, the little wooden door that sort of formed itself inside to go to the realm between realms inside of that location. We were going to have that kind of everywhere. So you'd have doors all over the place, and you could just open them up, and then you kind of go in like the Willy Wonka hallway with the forced perspective, and then
Yeah.
you'd open up another door, and you're like, oh, I'm in another realm. Uh, but that was also difficult, and we hadn't really thought it through. And it was like, all right, well, we probably need to make this all about a single central location, right? And that wasn't until pretty late in development. Like we were pretty far into the game, still me pitching, what if we had these pads all over the place and you could go on the pads and we'll have a loading thing there. And it's just every time we kind of hit the limits of the technology, right? The speed of the sort of loading and the way we sort of load different levels and how you would choose it, right? If you have 6 options, like you have to bring up a menu, and I really didn't want to bring up a menu. I wanted to kind of have something that was physical in the world. Uh, and so that little table that was a sort of a model of the world was kind of born of this. All right, well, I like the idea of our main space being this like giant clock travel mechanism that didn't function, but maybe it functions, right? Maybe we say that this functions and we'll use that to kind of travel to all these different places. And believe it or not, I mean, we didn't have a lot of details worked out of it. There was a lot of like, how does this work? And I'm always just like, but it just does. Yeah, it was a lot of like faith and duct tape and baling wire until smart people, right? The true, you know, engine of any team, the smart people on the team, which there's always a lot of, they're the ones that kind of dig down and start asking the right questions, coming up with some solutions and figuring out how we paste these things together. Um, and then artists who are saying like, we don't have any scope for this room, right? The room was completely out of scope. There was no way it was going to get done because it had to serve so many purposes that it couldn't really get arted until later because it had to be that room where everything would travel, but then it also had to flip upside down, and then it also had to rotate around, and then it also had to be inside of one of the largest and most complicated levels that our studio has ever done, right? We've never done a level of that scale and complexity with a giant animated character just like hanging out outside. So I made it as hard as possible for us, and then they solved every problem, figured it out bit by bit, but it came online pretty late. As with a lot of stuff, games are ugly, very ugly and scary, and we're gonna fail until like that last like few months, and all of a sudden it's like and it's easy to have confidence in those last few months because it's all coming together. But it's the real trick is having the confidence in the darker moments where it's like, man, this isn't all coming together, and being able to differentiate between we're actually on the Titanic and we're just kind of experiencing a little bit of turbulence, right? And both of those possibilities are very real in all these situations, right? And it takes a lot of trust in the team to be able to discern like, no, we got to act. This was bad. Like this thing is really bad. And we've been fortunate that the true 4 alarm fires are always identified, and hyperbolic freakouts are generally sort of a consensus that everyone understands. Okay, yeah, we're freaking out a little
I mean, the end result is just so much more than the sum of its parts, which is just so many. I mean, I couldn't count the names in the credits. Just so many
bit.
people put their blood, sweat, and tears into this game. One of those people, Bear McCreary, who did the music. Can you talk about how you found Bear, what attracted you to his work, and what he brought to the project?
Yeah, man, that was awesome. Because we talked about like what were we gonna do with the music, and I knew from the beginning that we had amazing people on the previous games, right? We had a brilliant cast, and we had amazing composers. You know, so many of them. We had different like 8 composers sometimes on a single project, and I loved their work. But I wanted us to kind of forge this new path. So I wanted to open our minds up to potentially looking at other people. So that even though I really would love to work with all of those composers again, I was like, I kind of want to see what it's like to maybe try a different flavor. But let's keep in contact because maybe that's not going to work. Like it might be the experiment that just doesn't work. And Pete Scaturo, who is kind of the head of the audio group, the music group, was like, okay, you know what? Let me go away. Let me think about this. I had given him a pitch of the game. It was still early on. I talked about things that were important to me and what things would feel like, and how this is really more of a very intimate and close and personal game as opposed to the over the top craziness, right? Like oh, make his head explode. Like that was something that might happen, but it wasn't our leading pitch, right? The pitch was far more about like these sort of complex and more intimate moments. And he thought about it for a little bit, and he came back and talked about it a couple people, and did the typical thing when people always lead with like, here's some ideas, but they save the real idea for last, so that they're kind of like gauging your response on each one, and they're like, yeah, but I'm really just gonna wow you on this last piece. And he's like, these are all really good, and I would love to work with any one of them. But there's somebody that's really special that I think would be very interesting, and I think you two might really hit it off. And he said, it's Bear McCreary. He's done some of these things. And I was like, man, why do I know that? And he started rattling off his credits. And I was like, what? Backstory of this is when my wife was pregnant with our son, we were binge watching Battlestar Galactica. And our favorite character in that series was Hilo, like the guy who was sort of bridging the gap between the Cylons and the humans. Just a really good person, right? And we were thinking of kid names and doing all that stuff. And she was super not into Han Solo Barlog and super not into Brom Barlog. So I was like, okay, I really like the alliteration of Brom, but it sounded like a villain. And Han Solo was just awesome, but I'm pretty sure no one's ever going to let that name slide through. And Hilo kind of kept coming back in the name, and we were like, man, that's perfect. So our kid is named after what we were at the time, is still now is one of our favorite shows. So to be able to work with the person who wrote the theme for that, and then also was composer on The Walking Dead and Agents of Shield, like he's done everything. The guy literally works nonstop. I was like, this is awesome. But then the reality set in, where I was like, okay, somebody who I have a huge admiration for is going to come into the studio, and I'm going to try to pitch him, right? And so I got nervous, like big time nervous. I mean, I always get nervous talking in front of people and doing pitches, but this was like beyond because it meant so much. Like I needed it to succeed. So I still was holding it together and kind of giving him the pitch, and he seemed into it and excited, but I just could never tell if someone's like, yeah, it's great, and then they leave and they're like, that guy was an idiot, right? Like, who set this meeting up? I need to fire my agent, right? So as we were walking to leave, I was impatient and I couldn't wait. So I was like, so what do we do, man? What's the fuck? Are we gonna do this or what? You wanna work together? It was like the most abrupt, like inelegant way to say like, let's do this. And he was like, oh yeah. And I was like, yeah. And I was like, what did I just do? I asked him for a high five. Like we sealed the deal on a high five. That's pretty cornball. But like it was that connection that I could be a complete dork, and he can acknowledge that I'm a dork because he himself is also a dork, and we were both realizing this was the dork match made in heaven. Working together through this entire thing was equally the most amazing and frustrating experiences because I always felt like I had to give a note, but I had no notes most of the time because the music was so good. He'd deliver something that I'd just be like, this is beyond what I wanted, what I expected. This is so perfect. This makes me want to go back and create something more because it's so good. But then it makes me feel ineffective because I feel like I'm not doing anything. I'm telling him about what we're making in the game, and then he's bringing these things that are amazing, and I'm like, I wouldn't literally change a thing. This is awesome. And then he'd go back and create more music. You know, he scored the E3 2016 demo. Uh, and I just asked for 30 seconds. We had like a 9-minute demo. I was like, I'll give you the playthrough. It's really crude, it's really rough. Uh, but if you have some ideas of just some loops, or like a couple of pieces, then we can kind of like make that work throughout, like an ambient piece and a combat piece, and I'll make it work. Don't worry that it's 9 minutes. He's like, oh, okay. And he comes back 3 weeks later, and he had original scored the whole thing. He didn't
Wow.
just write like a single piece. He scored the entire thing. He said, no, this is great. I love it. And I was like, oh, okay. Well, if you love that, I have accidentally signed you up for something. And he's like, well, what are you talking about? I was like, as a joke, I mentioned to them, what if we did the demo to a live orchestra and we had Bear, conduct that live orchestra while I was playing? And they were like, oh, that's crazy. Oh, no, maybe. We'll get back to you. And then they came back a couple weeks later and said, yeah, this is totally what we're doing. And I was like, ooh, I better tell Bear that I just signed him up for this. And he was super excited. Like he was just enthusiastic as all hell to do it. And I was still like one of my favorite parts of that was seeing him get so just into this whole process was amazing.
um, and again, like it's just such a great part of the game that the
Yeah,
music, it's kind of a hairs on the back of your arms kind of stand
I
up. But
know, right? Oh, every single time I hear anything, I'm always like, I can't believe we were able to trick him into working with us. It's so good.
so I'm just getting. I think we're probably just about at time, so I'm just going to finish up with one last question. Thanks to everyone for sticking with us. Um, I had one of my smart instructors at school once told me that stories are about like, the promise of change, that you can change and change is possible. And God of War 5 is one of the first games that I've played to have really got that across as well. How did you feel you changed, over the process of making this game? How has it changed you?
Wow. Man, I changed a lot. Uh, from the beginning of the game, I was far more, and I feel like I've aged physically about 10 more years than I worked, so about 15 years older. Um, I think I've gotten a little bit wiser to all the mistakes that I thought I was wise to. And I think this is sort of the truism I've had throughout my entire career that I imagine. I've talked to a few people, but not everyone in the world. So I don't know if this happens to everybody, but it seems to happen to a lot of people, is that every time you feel like you figured it out or you made a breakthrough, like, oh yeah, I totally get this now, you've really only kind of gotten like a small percentage of it and you're about to have another breakthrough. And wow, all this is amazing. And then you're getting comfortable with that breakthrough and figuring it out and getting, oh yeah, now, all right, now I totally get it. And you don't, right? Like every time we think we're making these like 25% increments, we're making 0.25% increments, right? We are making these fractional sort of advancements, even though they feel like these massive revelations. Uh, because when I came back, I really thought like, man, I learned so much from George, and I really did. Like, I feel like I actually in those instances, as a director and as a writer, as sort of a creative and my understanding of what it means to make something and connect with an audience, it definitely advanced like 10%, right? Which is massive, I think, in one sort of fell swoop. But it was like, 4 years, 5 years of that. And then it kind of clicks. And it took working on the Tomb Raider thing to let it marinate. And then the first 2 years on God of War to really start to let it set in. And then 2 years later, after releasing it, feel like, wow, okay, I get it. There are certain things I know not to sweat. There are certain things I understand a little bit clearer. But as much as I feel like I understand characters, as much as I understand drama, as much as I understand how to draw people in, I'm still just a student. I'm still just starting out. And it may seem disheartening to people who are just starting out, but this you're never going to get away from it, right? Like George Miller is like in his 70s, and he says the same thing. He says he feels like he's just trying to he's just figuring these things out, because that's the process. Like, you don't know any of these things. You are figuring it out. The figuring it out is the creative process. If there's no figuring it out, you're just executing. And a lot of times you can feel just executing. You can feel it. You can feel a game that just executed, that has neat stuff in there, and it looks really pretty, but they just executed. And a film, the same way, a story, a comic book, all these things you can feel when someone's pouring their soul out, when someone's being is being sort of like, pressed into this idea. That doesn't necessarily mean you're mimicking your own life, although some of the best things that I've seen have these kind of connections, that it may not be one to one, but it's in there. There is an aspect of that person that is in there. And I think that's the thing I would pass on to anybody who works in any creative industry, is you have to get comfortable with putting yourself into everything you do, right? And that doesn't just mean like immersing and going full bore and working hard. It means finding your faults, finding the things you're not good at, finding the things you're not proud of, finding the things that make you mad about yourself, because those are the interesting things. Those are the things that become the most true, right? Because as creative people, as writers, as filmmakers, as game makers, right, as musicians, we are all searching for a moment of truth. We are satisfied if we say something for 5 hours and there is a moment of truth in it, right? Because that is gold. That doesn't always happen. And if you can string enough moments of truth together, you get this experience that holistically feels phenomenal, right? And it isn't just some rote process of arranging the sort of elements together, right? It's not a connect the dots. It's not a arranging notes in the right place. It is the fact that, going back to Bear, talking about writing the theme for Kratos, the least interesting part is to say, I want brass and bombastic, and I want it to feel like, it's a marching band or something like that. And much more about, like, this is a guy who his entire life has made every wrong decision, and who has almost like alcoholism being his rage, right? Alcohol and rage, and he's hit rock bottom with rage over and over and over again. And the rock bottom goes further and further down, and he has this one hand reach out to pull him further up out of this rock bottom, but he still doesn't understand how to accept that help. That description excites the person making the music. And there is nothing about that is all about like this sort of, I want an action hero and he's an anti-hero, but he's now the hero and he does something great and he works at Best Buy, right? Like, none of those things truly matter. What matters is, as a human being, how am I connecting to this character? How am I relating, right? Because even though I can't relate one to one to each of these things, I have felt sad. I have hit a point where it felt hopeless, right? And that connection is like a line drawn through all the things that you're putting together. And I've talked to a lot of people who are resistant to share part of who they are in this. Oh, that's too personal. I can't put that in. Don't ever say that. Just don't make it obvious that it's you, right? But channel whatever's inside of there, because those are the interesting things. That's what makes you unique. Because not only did you go through that, whatever it is, but you had a different perspective of when you went through that than when somebody else went through that. It's always unique and different to each individual. And that is the power that all of us have, is that we bring something of our own. We find our own way in. You could be doing a adaptation of somebody else's work, but you could find your way into that work that is unique from anybody else's perspective. How you connect with it in a way that nobody else is connected with it, and you share that. Like, that is the power that I think all of us have. And sometimes we get caught up on the sort of I don't want to say the details. It's more like the process, right? Because the process is the scary thing. When I was in school, I was always wanting people to explain the process. What's the process? How do you format this? What is the step here? What do you do here? But sometimes not knowing any of that stuff and just going with, I feel this. and I want this to be conveyed to other people, is amazing, and it's effective. There was a guy who directed a documentary called Dark Days, and it's about the homeless population living in the subways in New York. And he wasn't a filmmaker. He was just a guy in New York that heard about people living in the subways and just decided to go down there and start exploring and start talking to all these people and realizing that there's this whole community down there. And they kept saying, you should make a movie. He was like, yeah, you know what? Why not? And then he went to a pawn shop and bought a camera. And they shot the whole film and had everybody in the homeless population be part of the crew, right? And then when he was ready to finish the film, he had been using DJ Shadow's music editing. And they were like, well, you got to bring new music in here because we're never going to get DJ Shadow. He's like, oh, I don't know. Why not? I'm going to send him a copy of the film. Like, who knows? Maybe he'll like it. He liked it, and he wrote an original track for the film, right? And the essence of what this was he said, if I had known everything that I had to do to make the film and to go through all these process to understand what it would be to try to sell a film to a film festival, all this stuff, I never would have done it.
Yeah.
But I lived in the moment. I followed this sort of instinct that I had, and I just charged forward through it. So you may not know any of the official processes or the way things are done in individual studios because it's different everywhere else. It doesn't matter. You're an individual, unique person who's going to bring something that none of us ever thought of. And I think that's the biggest takeaway I would ever have from any of us.
Well, thank you so much for that. It's like really inspiring stuff, and I'm sure there's a ton of storytellers listening who are now feeling fired up to go and speak their truths. Which all the best to all of you. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in.
One more thing on that the storytelling thing. Like, don't try to pitch ideas for existing games to people in studios. It's literally the worst thing that you could ever do. Yes. Write a story that is like, here's a God of War story or a World of Warcraft story or anything like that. Don't ever do that because no one will read it. Because legally, none of us can read it. We can't hear pitches from people. If you pitch ideas, it's just going to get lost in the ether because none of us can listen to it. Because eventually it could be like, you stole this idea from me. So when you're writing anything, write for yourself or, write something original. Like, obviously people do like pilot spec scripts and stuff like that. That's different. The game industry is not like that. Nobody's looking for the pilot Halo script or the spec script for, Control or anything like that. Like, it's just not, we're not a mature enough industry to have the legal resources to protect ourselves from any of that. So it will fall on deaf ears. Write something that is personal to you, that attaches, your being to it and makes people feel something. But yeah, never, ever say, I have a great idea for what you should do for this game. Because it's just never going to get listened to. Anyway. Sorry.
I hope everyone takes that to heart as well. It's something you see a lot of game devs on Twitter saying, please don't send us scripts for our own games. So don't do that, but do be honest and go out there and write something, guys. Thanks to Max and Fraser for setting this up. Thanks to John Meadows for turning me onto this. And thank you, Cory. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for a wonderful game, and I can't wait for the next one.
Oh, thank you very much. This was awesome, and I love doing it. Invite me back anytime. Totally had a blast with this. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much. All right. Well, take care, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Bye.